Mrs. Cranky wasn't very keen to leave her mother sticking up through a roof for the rest of her life. So in the end, 2 men came with a crane and lifted Grandma out. George's medicine hadn't made her any less grumpy or bad-tempered, but it had made her very tall. And the only place for her to sleep was in the hay barn with the mice and rats. In the meantime, George and his father had used up all the medicine making gigantic animals. They gave it to the pig, the bullocks, the sheep, the pony, and the nanny goat. The Marvellous medicine was so fantastic that George and his father went straight back indoors to make some more. The new mixture looked and smelt just as powerful as the first lot, but just to make sure, George took a spoonful out into the farmyard to try it out on one of the chickens. "Come on, chicken," he said. "Good chicken. Chick, 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 chick." A white chicken with black specks on the feathers walked over to the spoon and went, peck. The effect that medicine number 2 had on this chicken was not quite the same as the effect produced by medicine number 1, but it was very interesting. "Row!" shrieked the chicken, and it shot 6 feet up in the air and came down again. Then sparks came flying out of its beak, bright yellow sparks of fire, as though someone was sharpening a knife on a grindstone inside its tummy. Then its legs began to grow longer. Its body stayed the same size, but the 2 thin yellow legs got longer and longer and longer. "What's happening to it?" cried Mr. Killicranky. "Something's wrong," said George. The chicken looked perfectly absurd, with its long, long legs and its ordinary little body perched high up on top. It was like a chicken on stilts. "Oh, my sainted aunts!" cried Mr. Killicranky. "This chicken's no good to anybody. It's all legs. No one wants chicken's legs." "Well, I must have left something out," George said. "I know you've left something out," cried Mr. Cranky. "Think, boy, think. What was it you left out?" "I've got it," said George. "Flea powder for dogs. And I used some brown shoe polish, too." Mr. Cranky was already running to his car, and soon he was heading down to the village to buy more flea powder and more shoe polish. When he got back, George poured the flea powder into the giant saucepan, then he scooped the shoe polish out of its tin and added that as well. This was Marvellous medicine number 3. George boiled it and stirred it just as before, then he took a spoonful of it out into the yard to try on another chicken. Mr. Cranky ran after him, flapping his arms and hopping with excitement. "Come and watch this one," he called out to Mrs. Cranky. "Come and watch us turning an ordinary chicken into a lovely great big one that lays eggs as large as footballs." "I hope you do better than you did last time," said Mrs. Cranky. "Come on, chicken," said George. "Chick, chick, 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 chick. Have some of the lovely medicine." And a magnificent black cockerel with a scarlet comb came stepping over. The cockerel looked at the spoon and went, peck. Then, ah, 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 ah! George and his father and mother watched as the cockerel shot up into the air and came back down again. "Watch him now," cried Mr. Cranky. "Watch him grow. Any moment he's going to start getting bigger and bigger." The cockerel stood quite still. It looked as though it had a headache. "What's happening to its neck?" Mrs. Cranky asked. "It's getting longer," said George. "I'll say it's getting longer," said Mrs. Cranky. "Last time it was the legs, now it's the neck. Who wants a chicken with a long neck? You can't eat a chicken's neck." It was an extraordinary sight. The cockerel's body hadn't grown at all, but the neck was now about 6 feet long. "All right, George," said Mr. Cranky. "What else have you forgotten?" "I don't know," said George. "Oh, yes, you do," said Mr. Cranky. "Come along now, boy. Think. There's probably just one vital thing missing, and you've got to remember it." I put in some engine oil from the shed," said George. "Did you have that on your list?" Eureka! cried Mr. Cranky. "That's the answer. Right, how much did you put in?" "Half a pint," George said. "You're going to have some mighty queer chickens around here if you go on like this," said Mrs. Cranky, as they boiled up Marvellous medicine number 4. "You keep out of this," said Mr. Cranky. "We're doing fine. We've got it this time. You see if we haven't." George took a teacup full of the new medicine outside, dipped in the spoon, and held it out to a brown hen. "Chick, chick, chick," he said. Try some of this. The brown hen walked over and looked at the spoon. Then it went, pick. Ouch, it said. And then a funny whistling noise came out of its beak.
Watch it grow,
shouted Mr. Cranky. Don't be too sure, said Mrs. Cranky. Why is it whistling like that?
Keep quiet, woman,
cried Mr. Cranky.
Give it a chance.
It's getting smaller, said George. Look at it, Dad, it's shrinking. And indeed it was. In less than a minute, the hen was no bigger than a new hatched chick. It looked ridiculous. Oh, give it up, said Mrs. Cranky. Pack it in. You'll never get it right. And at that point, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the three people below her, and she shouted, "What's going on around here? Why hasn't anybody brought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough having to sleep in the barn with the rats and the mice, but I'll be blowed if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs and bacon, no buttered toast." "Oh, I'm sorry, Mother," Mrs. Cranky said. "We've been terribly busy. I'll get you something right away." "Let George get it, the lazy little brute," Grandma shouted. Just then, the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it, and she saw that it was full of brown liquid. It looked very much like tea. "Ho, ho!" she cried. "Ha, ha! So that's your little game, is it? You look after yourself all right, don't you? You make sure you've got a nice cup of morning tea, but you didn't think to bring one to your poor old Grandma. I always knew you were a selfish pig. Hand it over, George." "No," cried Mrs. Cranky. "No, Mother, don't. That's not for you." "Now you're against me too," shouted Grandma. "My own daughter, trying to stop me having my breakfast, trying to starve me out." Mr. Cranky looked up at the horrid old woman, and he smiled sweetly.
Of course it's for you, Grandma, he said. You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot.
"Don't think I won't," Grandma said, bending down from her great height and reaching out a huge horny hand for the cup. "No, no, Grandma," George cried out, pulling the cup away. "You mustn't. You're not to have it." "Give it to me, boy," yelled Grandma. "Don't," cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's George's Marvellous." "Everything's George's round here," shouted Grandma. "George this, George that. I'm fed up with it." And she snatched the cup. She snatched it out of little George's hand and carried it high up out of reach.
"Drink it up, Grandma,"
Mr. Cranky said, grinning hugely.
"Lovely tea."
"No!" the other two cried. "No, no, no!" But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp she swallowed everything that was in it. "Mother," wailed Mrs. Cranky, "you've just drunk 50 doses of George's Marvellous Medicine No. 4, and look what one tiny spoonful did to that little brown hen." But Grandma didn't even hear her. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth and nose and ears, and she was beginning to whistle.
"This is going to be interesting,"
Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. "Now you've done it," cried Mrs. Cranky, glaring at her husband. "You've cooked the old girl's goose."
"I didn't do anything,"
Mr. Cranky said. "Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it." A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam was still shooting out of Grandma's head and whistling as it came.
"She'll feel better after she's let off a bit of steam,"
Mr. Cranky said. "She's going to blow up," Mrs. Cranky wailed. "Her boiler's going to burst."
"Stand clear,"
said Mr. Cranky. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old hag's head, and the whistling was so high and shrill it hurt his ears. "Call the fire brigade!" cried Mrs. Cranky. "Call the police! Man the hose pipes!"
"Too late,"
said Mr. Cranky, looking pleased. "Grandma!" shrieked Mrs. Cranky. "Mother, run to the drinking trough and put your head under the water." But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She'd started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down fast.
"Watch this, George,"
shouted Mr. Cranky, hopping around the yard and flapping his arms. "Watch what happens when someone's had 50 spoonfuls instead of one." Very soon, Grandma was back to normal height. "Stop!" cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's just right." But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got. Down and down she went. In another moment, she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. "How do you feel, Mother?" asked Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul and furious expression it always had. Her eyes, no bigger now than little keyholes, were blazing with anger. "How do I feel?" she yelled. "How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you'd been a glorious giant a minute ago and suddenly you're a miserable midget?"
She's still going,
shouted Mr. Cranky gleefully.
She's still getting smaller.
And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a pencil, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and she cried, "How do I stop her getting smaller still?"
You can't, said Mr. Cranky. She's had 50 times the right amount.
By then, Grandma was the size of a matchstick and still shrinking fast. A moment later, she was no bigger than a pin, then a pumpkin seed, then... "Where is she?" cried Mrs. Cranky. "I've lost her."
Hooray,
said Mr. Cranky. "She's gone. She's disappeared completely," cried Mrs. Cranky.
Well, that's what happens to you if you're grumpy and bad-tempered, said Mr. Cranky. Great medicine of yours, George.
George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes, Mrs. Cranky kept wandering around with a puzzled look on her face, saying, "Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you got to? How can I find you?" But she calmed down quite quickly. And by lunchtime, she was saying, "Oh, well, I suppose it's all for the best, really. She was a bit of a nuisance round the house, wasn't she?"
Yes, said Mr. Cranky. She most certainly was.
George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning. For a few brief moments, he had touched with the very tips of his fingers the edge of a magic world. Goodbye.